Welcome to Richard and Greg, a channel dedicated to discussion, debate and argument on a whole array of topics. Last night we conducted an interview with Greg for an update on the coronavirus, and interestingly, one of his most memorable quotes is to warn your children not to kill their parents or grandparents accidentally. So let's listen to what he and I were talking about. Well, today is Thursday, the 12th of March, 2020, and the time is 22:20 GMT. And what an incredible day it's been. Stock markets across the world in free fall, gold and silver prices falling, sterling falling against the dollar, oil prices down. And virtually the only thing to rise is the United States dollar, when we've been told by pumpers and so-called economists that the dollar was about to collapse and pandemonium to domain. Well, there has been pandemonium. In fact, the World Health Organization has officially declared today that the coronavirus is now a global pandemic. And talking of pandemics, who best to speak to than our old friend, controversially, Greg. Greg, good evening.
Good evening, Richard. And isn't it an interesting coincidence in these fairly auspicious times that you phoned me, you contacted me at 2020 in the year 2020?
I was going to call you at 666, but that doesn't exist, does it, Greg? That would have sent all the conspiracy theorists alive.
You must stop reading that number off of that engraving on your wrist. Standing on your head, it actually says 999.
Yeah. What's happening today, Greg? I hear it's quite a lot.
It's not been a good day for mankind, I think, is probably the easiest way to put it. We're now up to 134,488. I think we can safely say within the next few hours, before we get up again, we will be over 135,000 recognized cases. I'm going to come back to that in a second. We have a mortality rate now at 4,970. Well, in my book, that's near as damn it 5,000. Coming back to the number of cases, more and more people are realizing that at the early outset in this disease, there is little or no way of stopping it arriving because we have too much of an interconnected world, point one. Point two, it's probably arrived by now. So there is little point in testing people unless they fit the criterion of having been to one of the high risk areas, which seems to be more than the odd cruise liner, and Italy, Iran, China, and that's about it for really high risk. Though, following up, South Korea, Spain, France, Germany, and America are all at about 2,000 or more cases recorded in their countries. Then there's quite a drop to Switzerland at 868. We can go through the list, but that is a bit tedious, and they all tell you the same thing. Once it gets hold, it grows. There's little way to stop it catching on. I question whether there is any point in blocking countries from traveling other than from Italy, Iran, South Korea, and maybe Spain and France. But that's up to individual governments. I think the British government has played it just about damned right so far. We've managed to control it, although we were one of the countries that was first to spread because of our regular contacts with China. We still only have 590 cases recorded. We still only have 10 deaths. We're saying only from the point of view of looking at it as a country with 67 million people in a fairly well-off group in the main relative to other countries around the world who travel extensively.
Greg, on that note, when you say we've managed to contain it, and then at the start you said there's no point doing any testing unless people come from a high-risk country, can you explain those two in a little more depth? Because it doesn't quite make sense to me.
It does sound like an anomaly. However, there's little point in testing people on a general basis unless they've come from a high-risk country or been in contact with somebody, purely and simply because the spread between people who have not been to a high-risk country and not been in contact with somebody known to have it is so minimal at the moment in Britain, with only just under 600 cases that we're aware of, that actually it probably wouldn't make that much difference. Though I will say that from today's figures, you will find that Britain will probably increase relatively rapidly to around 10,000. Will probably be somewhere around 10 or 12,000 cases by the end of this month, if not a little before then.
So now I'm even more confused. You've said we've managed to contain it extremely well to now, and then you'll say within no time at all, the number of cases is going to rise 20-fold. I'm now a bit lost.
That is not no time at all when you look at this virus. We have managed to control it to stay low.
How?
So far, by our measures to immediately put people into quarantine, which we've done probably more than any other country at this earlier stage. We have put entire groups of people into facilities in quarantine, particularly people coming back from high-risk areas or people who have been in contact with known sufferers. So we have controlled the rapidity of the spread at this early stage, which was an intelligent thing to do. I believe that Boris Johnson has managed this superbly so far. He has acted somewhat similarly to Neville Chamberlain over the Munich issue, where on return he waved a piece of paper saying, "I've spoken to Mr. Hitler, there will be peace in our time," and drove straight to Downing Street, where Lord Halifax had convened a cabinet meeting, which was the cobra of its day, and he walked in, took his coat off, said, "Could we have a cup of tea all round, and gentlemen, prepare for war." He had bought himself time in which to rearm. Boris Johnson, in his handling of it so far, has managed it excellently to buy time for the winter viruses that are common and the winter ailments that tend to clog up our hospitals in winter to work through the system. He's put off the peaks on this so that they will occur after the end of that period, sometime towards the end of April. And he has managed to buy time in which to prepare wards, bring out of mothball wards that haven't been in use to use for virus and for isolation, and train staff and ensure that we can get hold of as many hazard suits for our nursing personnel and as many ventilators as we possibly can before needing our full capacity, which I believe will be towards the end of May through June and July. I may be wrong, but that's how I see it at this stage. And when you think that Italy is probably 3 or 4 weeks ahead of us and has 15,000 cases now, which is my estimate for the end of this month. It has 1,000 dead so far. The other thing is that I would like to stress to everybody, the young are taking this far too lightly based on the selfish principle that this particular disease is not killing the young in any quantities. The overall figure being quoted is about 3% mortality. Now, I would contend that when you actually look at it closely, it is more like 7%. There's no point in going into the detail in this brief exposition of what's going on, but that 7% means that there's quite a small percentage, probably 0.5% of those who catch it, who are under 40, actually dying of it. But somewhere in the region of 15% of those who catch it, who are 70 and over, will die from it. So if you're a student away at university, or an apprentice somewhere, living away from home, or young enough to be working away from home and not with a family of your own, please don't go home and kill your parents. Because very realistically, it is parents who are 40 and upwards who are at risk of dying from this virus. Stay away from them. They will understand that you're staying away because you care, and where possible and practical, try to shelter them from the risk that is so very present and so very threatening. Stay away from parents and grandparents. Strange advice at a time of need, but advice that could well save their lives.
Greg, you mentioned earlier Italy, and you said approximately, if I remember correctly, was it 15,000 infections and over 1,000 deaths? Is that right?
Correct, 113 infected and 1,016 recognized dead.
So that's about 7%, is that right, I think?
That's about 7%. And
Yeah.
bear in mind, the majority of that 7% total will be people in the age group of 70 and upwards. And also bear in mind that of those 15,000 cases, 12,800 are still active cases. Only about 1,200 have recovered from the disease. So 1,200 recovered, 1,000 dead, that's 2,260 or 70 who have recovered either from being active cases, either by dying or by recovering to good health. That means there are 12,839 more cases that are still active, but we're already on 7%. That's 7% of those who have no longer active. So I would say that 7% is possibly half of the number in that particular 15,000. So I think that you will have over 2,000 die out of the 15,000, but you will have an increase on a per diem basis for a while, escalating from today's figure of new cases of 2,651 to make up some fairly dramatic and scary arithmetic. The Cosa Nostra doesn't seem to have a particular protection racket to run for Italy.
What's the case with America? Because that's obviously hitting the news headlines as well.
But the case for America in terms of having a statistical analysis of it is a total joke, in that they have a population of approximately 370 million people, and at best they have 1.3 million test kits. They have no health service worth a damn for the vast majority of their people. Even if they had the test kits, people won't be getting tested because of the cost of being tested, which will be passed straight on to them, having no health service. The only people who will be tested will be those who are better off and can afford the test, and the only people who will be showing up as having the virus will be those who can afford to be treated. Now, I can't see anybody in America being able to get treated unless they are insured for under $3,000 to $5,000. So you can write off, I would say, probably 80% of the American population who just will not be able to afford treatment, because America is a land of great poverty. You can drive for mile upon mile through broken down clapboard housing in the Midwest. You can drive around miles of project dwellings where half of them are boarded up because they're just uninhabitable in areas like Baltimore or Detroit. There are so many people who are left behind in America that I would say, although they're showing 1,650 cases, that in their complacency, they probably will have nearer 100,000 cases at the moment, but they're just not recording them because they're only people. There is one proviso I would make on this. Nobody has actually broken down, and I understand the politically correct sensitivity of why they haven't, but do different ethnic groups have different immunity to this disease? I question whether that might be the case, because you will find there are incredibly few instances recorded in sub-Saharan Africa, in the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, where you have more purebred African peoples, and yet many of those countries are all but owned by China. The mining industry of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, the slave labor in the mines that are being processed to keep the Western world's mobile phones going, etc. There are flights to and fro China daily. Not only are there these assorted assets that China has built up, but there is a regular trade, albeit criminal, between China and Africa in the massacre of elephants and rhinos for their horn. Ivory and rhino horn are highly prized, as are pangolin scales, regardless of the brutality of those criminal activities. They are instigated by the Chinese, who underpin that market and encourage thereby the poaching and criminality that is rife in Africa. For instance, the killing of somewhere in the region of 8 rhinos an hour across the whole of Africa, just for that compressed hair that is purely keratin, that is a rhino horn. Mm-hmm. Now, with that much contact between China and sub-Saharan Africa, how come there are so incredibly few cases recorded?
Could that just be either governmental cover-up or incompetence, or shall we just say insufficient data being gathered?
Yes. However, could it equally be that the immune systems of different ethnic groups differs, which one could reasonably expect? The ability of most Africans to process certain foods that are not well processed by the white gut of other humans. There are differences. There could well be differences in the people between immune systems. I know it's not very politically correct to ask the question, but when it is talking of the survival of mankind, I really don't have a problem with somebody saying I'm not being politically correct.
Well, Greg, before we go, what's your estimation of what's going to happen over the next few days?
I think it's going to steadily climb. I think that America's going to become increasingly aware of what a parlous system of poverty they have, as they are unable to treat people. I think our health system will do an incredibly good job and be found wanting, because I don't think any health system can be well enough organized. I think for the stage at which the disease has spread in Italy, that they have done the right thing by shutting all shops except chemists and food stores, shutting all cafes, bars and restaurants, and doing so for a fairly prolonged period of time. However, with the Italian economy, which is flaky, with the Italian political system, which is even more flaky, with a propensity for a new government once a fortnight, perhaps I exaggerate a little, and managed largely by a bureaucratic committee dictatorship in Brussels and Strasbourg, I personally think that we're going to see some fairly difficult situations in Italy. And I don't think that the Italian health service is going to be able to cope with it. And I think that this will call into question hugely the utter incompetence of the European experiment with its no borders. And you only have to look at other countries in Europe that are beginning to march up the tables. Sweden, 687 people with the disease. Denmark, which is about the size of a large postage stamp, 674 people with the disease. Norway, 797. Germany, 2,747. France, 2,876. Spain, 3,146. I think that in the long term, the European Union is going to take a real battering.
Indeed, and perhaps the rest of the world too. Having looked at the stock markets, Europe, including Britain, stock markets down between 10 and 14% in one day, Greg. And although I commented earlier that the Dow has fallen 2,000 points, that's still less than 10 to 14%. So certainly it seems at this moment in time, the financials seem to bear you out. And with European interest rates already in minus figures, and Christine Lagarde coming out today with a massive QE package, rather than actually give confidence to markets, it had exactly the opposite effect. So
there is one thing. You take, for instance, the excellent budget that was put forward in Britain yesterday, and it was excellent under the circumstances. Not a budget one would wish to have seen otherwise, because it would appear to be very dependent on borrowing. But what nobody has pointed out is that that borrowing, unlike the borrowing we saw during the period of the 13 years of misfortunate misrule by Labour, when their borrowing was high and they had no means of repaying it, and they near as damn it bankrupt the country, this borrowing is actually underwritten. It's underwritten by the fact that we are likely to make massive savings on pensions. because it will be pensioners who are dying.
And on that cheerful note, thank you very much, Greg.
My pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed that discussion, and if so, kindly subscribe to our channel and press the bell sign so that you are notified of our videos as and when they are published. And also in the description box below, we place links to certain books, articles, and programs which you may find of benefit, and for which we will receive a small commission should you purchase through our link. And this will help support our channel and to enable us to develop it further.